When the power of steam was king, ruling the industrial onslaught of the 1800s, Australia was as much engulfed in a development craze as Europe and America. Although on the other side of the world, this colony quickly became swept up in the frenzy of creating a spiderweb of iron rails all over the country. Still an outpost of the mother country, Australian railways were as strongly influenced by England as was the rest of our daily lives. The design for most of our locomotives was distinctly English, and despite local workshops churning out large numbers, many hundreds of our engines were built over there and shipped out as fully assembled deck cargo. In the far southern corner of Australia, Alister Matheson is a gentleman who wants to reverse this process, just once.
This is the first time that an Australian-built locomotive has ever been taken to the United Kingdom.
An excellent way to view the extent of English influence on our culture is a visit to Tasmania. With similarities in geography and climate, the architecture here simply completes the picture. In his own little pocket of this island state, about as far away from the equator as one can get in Australia, Alister Matheson built a working old-style timber mill in 1979. Symbolic of one of the country's most prolific industries, it's typical of hundreds of such mills which were once dotted throughout the Australian bush.
The concept of timber mills at the turn of the century was very, very exciting to look back on and see how, with, I suppose, what you could call limited resources, these people worked and how they achieved what they achieved. It's probably got something to do with immortality and wanting to create things that last forever. And those things that have passed we want to recreate again.
In 1986, Alister somehow found himself up to his knees building an ambitious extension to his mill, a narrow-gauge steam railway inspired from one photograph.
English aristocrat and railway engineer Sir Arthur Haywood started it all off by developing this 15-inch gauge system, and it was a photograph from his original railway given to me by my 8-year-old daughter in a book one year for Christmas that inspired me to build what is now the Bushmill Railway. Once we had created the Bushmill, I felt that we had to go on to a further stage, and I wanted to put, because of my interest in steam and steam railways generally, I would have loved to have put in a railway. But because of the terrain, it was virtually impossible to do that. And it was Sir Arthur Haywood's vision that he had back in the early 1870s. And he achieved it. He got these little railways up through remarkable gradients and around very, very tight curves. And as soon as I saw the photograph, I knew straight away, why can't we do this? Well, the thousands of people who ride the train, of course, probably don't realise the amount of effort, physical and mental effort that went into its creation. But then neither they should. It's there for their enjoyment and their appreciation of steam. The reward for me is in completing the project and making it work. About 12 months after we finished our railway, I was in England and I accidentally came across a book which was a printed edition of Sir Arthur Haywood's original diary about his railways. And in the back of that edition were some superb glass plate photographs of the railway that he had built himself back in the 1870s at Duffield Bank. And when I looked at those photographs, I just could not believe what I was seeing, because without previous knowledge, our railways were just so similar, and it really took my breath away when I saw the photographs. Perhaps there was some unfinished business that he had to attend to.
Sir Arthur Haywood was an intelligent and creative engineer who endured the quaint frustration of being both ahead of the times and behind them all at once. In the latter half of the 1800s, he devoted his work to what became known as minimum gauge railways, where he could see the benefit in small, cheaper, easier to handle construction. 15-inch gauge, he contended, was big enough to handle heavy loads, but small enough to be operated by one man. It was also capable of negotiating very steep gradients and tight curves. Sir Arthur had a vision of developing his estate railways, tiny private lines which would link the farming land of the manors with the full-size railway network and their connected markets. But he only ever completed two, one for himself and another for his good friend, the Duke of Westminster. Haywood's unique and distinctive engineering concepts were considered too revolutionary to be accepted then. By the time enough influential people were taking notice of his ideas, roads and motor lorries had captured the transport limelight, effectively eliminating the need for this type of railway. His life's work was already obsolete. However, Haywood's essential belief in narrow gauge did take hold all over the world. Small railways of all shapes and sizes played a vital role in the relentless spread of transport services. In Victoria, another of Australia's premier tourist attractions, Puffing Billy, is a living revival of an actual narrow gauge railway. At the turn of the century, local activity was centred around the train, and the humble station master was a highly placed community member. Now, nearly 250,000 passengers a year continue the long-standing tradition of riding on Puffing Billy through the Dandenong Ranges.
Looking at getting onto the map in the railway world.
The local media muse over whether this is the antic of an enthusiast, an entrepreneur, or a bit of a crackpot.
It'll certainly put us and Tasmania in this locomotive.
It's all come together, 6 months of organising, raising finance, finding a ship. Now it's actually happening. Ahead of the locomotive is 6 weeks at sea, and tomorrow the first step in that journey begins. It's a fairly safe bet that no matter how far ahead work begins, there's always going to be a bag full of jobs to do on the last night. Final testing is enough excuse for a last run up the hill in steam, a reward for the previous night's work, and a tension release for the troops. While taking a complete steam engine to England may be outside the limits of hand luggage, with modern transport systems, it's actually not as difficult as may first appear. After the initial, "You're going to what?" from bystanders, a common question centred around whether the container had been specially built for the task, and the answer was no. A standard ANL 20-footer had a simple frame set up to act as rails placed on the floor. Once inside, the locomotive would simply be pinned to this frame with a brace at the front and back. The shipping container has revolutionised freight handling. Loading this cargo is like pointing a kid's train set into a shoebox. The ship's taking its cargo about as far away from Australia as you can go, literally to the other side of the world. Once on English soil, the great little train from Downunder will tour two of the country's famous 15-inch gauge railways, the Ravenglass and Eskdale in the north and the Romney Hythe and Dymchurch down on the southeast corner.
We needed a bigger, more powerful locomotive that was suited to our very steep gradients and our very tight curves on the track.
The particular locomotive that's been chosen to be bundled off to England has a strong personal attachment for everyone at the Bush Mill, particularly as it was hand-built at the mill. Co-owner and driver Lester Jones is the man responsible for the engine's construction. There are very few off-the-shelf items for making steam engines these days, so virtually everything had to be scratch-built from raw materials.
99% of it is handmade. The boiler was built by a local boiler maker in Hobart, but all the motions, the parts, the wheels and everything are all handcrafted.
Gradually, all the bits and pieces needed began to be churned out from inside the tiny workshop, aided only by a handful of basic tools. The quality of work was exceptional, further enhanced when you know that Lester had no formal engineering qualifications.
I commenced the engine in November of 1987, and after 3 years of building, we commissioned it on the 12th of December in 1990.
The engine actually has its own particular significance in railway history, being a half-size replica of another famous locomotive.
It's the only one of its kind in the world. The very first Garratt built in the world was built for the Tasmanian Government Railways back in the early 1900s.
Few places have better shown the conflict between preservation of nature and the onslaught of industry as Tasmania's West Coast. A wilderness of unmatched beauty, last century it derived a reputation for having one of the richest sources of mineral deposits in the world. The exploitation of that resource is well documented, and the controversy over its effect continues today. But whatever the ethical or ecological issues, the story of how that mineral source was able to be plundered in such harsh surroundings is indeed remarkable. Mining took hold with all the tenacity associated with this wild industry. Courage and perseverance were the keys to success. Large complexes shared the mountains with tiny one-man diggings in conditions often beyond comprehension in our modern world.
Sometimes on the West Coast you can get a good day. A lot of the old timers used to reckon it rained 364 days a year except in the leap year, and of course it was the extra day it rained.
Those days of hardship on the island's west coast have certainly captured the imagination of Lou Ray, a knowledgeable Tasmanian railway historian and prolific writer on the mining era.
To get round the West Coast, even with today's transport, still causes a lot of problems. Of course, 150 years ago, without any good transport, it was virtually impossible.
Lou can now only reminisce about how it was when the sound of steam, stampers and shovels echoed through the hills around Zeehan. Mining is all but extinct here now. The hammer mills fell into silence just as quickly as they began. Where near vertical mountainsides once boasted massive rail haulages, just the scars of their existence remain. At the foot of the Hercules haulage, ore was loaded into wagons at the head of a 2-foot gauge rail line where it went to Zeehan for processing in the smelters. The North East Dundas tramway was built by the Tasmanian government, with work beginning in 1895. It was just one of a myriad of railways and tramways meandering all over the West Coast, but certainly one of the most spectacular. Lou Ray well recognises the vital role of railways during the mining boom. Without those winding ribbons of steel, it would have been impossible to get the excavated tonnage out to the rest of the world. This was the domain of narrow gauge railways, snaking their way through the hills and valleys where no other transport could reach. But rails alone were not enough. The trial of finding suitable engines was a long and painful one.
They started off using Sharp Stewart locomotives. There were problems with that because they could only haul 20-tonne loads, and a big problem too was with the rain, slippery tracks, 1 in 25 grades. It was not economic to use those.
Finally, after waiting 10 years for a loco which simply split the rails and fell in the dirt on its first run, a different kind of approach was needed to tackle this rough, mountainous country. Salvation began in 1909 when the Bayer Peacock Company built 2 locos for the North East Dundas tramway, based on a radical new concept by Mr. R.H.D.R. Garrett. The dilemma of providing enough power on mountain railways had been pondered by this man for some time. His eventual design was effectively 2 locomotives in one, delivering power with manoeuvrability. From an idea to solve a local problem, a world-famous railway legend began with the birth of the original K1. Certainly the Garratts did not derive their success from beauty. Rather, an ugly duckling quality tended to endear them more to the railway enthusiast who had a better understanding of the locomotive's virtues. But with its bright green paint job and shining brass, the Bush Mills version has transformed the duckling into a swan. The harsh terrain of the West Coast has much in common with that of the Bush Mill. The power and versatility of the unique design appealed to Alister and Lester when they decided to build their own half-scale duplicate of K1. Its link with railway history and the story of the West Coast was a welcome bonus. The rails of the tramway have all been pulled up, and only a few sleepers or the occasional cutting give evidence to the existence of this once active transport link. The old trackbed is 4-wheel drive territory now, with several creek crossings where timber bridges once stood. But even a 4-wheel drive has limits, so it's up to the ever-reliable Blundstones to traverse the last section. The reward is worth the effort. Although it may be a long time since passengers on picnic trains were enveloped by the spray of Montezuma Falls, much discussion goes on about plans to restore the line. There is a dream to once again burst out of the rainforest and see the tallest waterfall in southern Australia from a railway carriage. As Mother Nature begins consuming scars from the West Coast mining invasion, tourism is in fact a new local industry. With the natural beauty of its rivers and rainforests being a powerful drawcard, the whole island of Tasmania is a tourist target. As an ever-increasing number of people want to sample this remote wonderland, modern forms of transport are facing constant pressure to increase their payload. But it's the more traditional tourist route the Aussie duo have taken to England to sample some British way of life before their train-laden ship arrives. How easy it is to become absorbed in the grand old city of London, taking in all the architecture, the people and the history aboard one of the city's most popular venues in use today. York has seen a lot of history, which reflects in its architecture. It's a wonderful experience wandering the narrow streets of this truly medieval city, contemplating names synonymous with its past. It's been in the hands of the Danes, Saxons and Normans. Even William the Conqueror made it a fortress. There's a contrast between the strength and the standards of these buildings. They may well have stood the test of time, but their construction also displays an extraordinary array of angles. Slopes of floors and curved walls are all perfectly described by the name for one of its more famous sections. For steam enthusiasts, there's a structure which, despite a modern intrusion on its surroundings, houses a veritable treasure trove of old goodies. In a city that became famous as a major transport centre, the National Rail Museum has the finest collection imaginable of railway products from the British steam era. Kept in immaculate condition, they range from the biggest and most powerful to the oldest and most famous. Although 25 years after the first recognised steam locomotive, Stephenson's rocket is generally associated with the beginning of railways. In 1829, it was the winner of a £500 prize to find the best suited locomotive for the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. This building also houses a locomotive of special interest to the touring Australians, for here is now the home of the original K1 Garratt. This may actually have been the first locomotive to travel across the ocean from Australia to England, but Alister's 15-inch gauge replica is the first Australian-built loco to do so, and certainly the first in steam. At the Barking container base near London, somewhere in a sea of containers, a lonely locomotive waits to be claimed like a puppy at a lost dog's home.
I think, as with all these things, if you take into account what sort of happens along the way, you probably would never have ever started the project. But this is just a fabulous experience. Yeah, to have come this far, 17,500 kilometres in 6 weeks, to open the doors and see the locomotive here on the other side of the world, beautifully intact, beautifully shipped, absolutely tremendous. Great thrill indeed.
Wrong spanner.
Don't tell me your shifter's not big enough. You'll have to stay in the container.
Back home.
British technology to the rescue.
English technology. That must be really interesting.
Got a one of those bars.
Ravenglass is a small coastal village in the northwest of England, right opposite the Isle of Man. Here in the Lakes district of Cumbria, farming ground is as rich as it looks. Ravenglass also has one of the most picturesque little steam trains, threading its way up into the hills from the seaside village.
Because we've been very thirsty with these things.
The many parallels that can be drawn between England and Australia even extend to this railway. The little visiting Garratt replica will actually be running on what was once a mining line with amazing similarities to the northeast Dundas tramway, home of the original Garratt in Australia. The interest in the Australian engine was mixed. Some were fascinated by the type of locomotive, some wanted to see the quality of engineering, and there were others who just wanted to see what this man from down under had brought halfway around the world. Pubs in England are legendary, and one such establishment is a trademark of Ravenglass. It's actually a pub on a railway station, and with such an appropriate address, the Ratty Arms is definitely a focus of activity after a long day on the trains. Proudly it stands on a platform beside the British Rail line, which services this coast, making it one of the better waiting rooms of any station. The now revered Ratty Arms started out as a conventional station building when Ravenglass was a busy junction with a mining line which ran a mere 7 miles up the valley to Dalegarth. Now it's a watering hole for the workers of the 15-inch gauge railway, where the newly arrived Australian locomotive is about to commence its tour of duty. The game of grown-up boys playing with their big train set is a serious one. Running a new engine isn't just a matter of hitching on some carriages and setting off. But it wasn't too long before the test train escaped the boundaries of the station yard. Charles Dean lives in a caravan in the station yard at Urton Road, midpoint of the journey. Every morning he convinces his gammy leg to carry him across the tracks to open up his station office.
Well, I first came to this railway as a young boy scout before the war, 1938. I became a member shortly after the society was started and the railway was taken over about 30 years ago. And as I grew older and I had more time to spare at work, I've been coming here regularly in the last 8 years as a station master. And now I'm fully retired. I bring my caravan for the whole year and help out during the busiest times.
While the thunder of trains catches most of the attention, a railway is really only the people working on it. Charles epitomises that spirit, faithfully looking after the only original station building on the Ravenglass and Eskdale.
all the boys were on a big long walk, and they missed the directions, and they were away for over an hour and a half, and then eventually we saw them going over the field over there, and they came down about half an hour later when they should have come over the bridge. And one of the women asked the chap who was in charge what they were doing. Oh, I went to the shop for some ice cream. But, I mean, you can believe that. I don't. I think they got lost. Oh, we get all kinds of people, especially those who are not very conversant with the English language. They get a wrong train, or we have to look after them, and sometimes they drink too much and we have to put them on the train. We don't get anything for it, really, except the enjoyment and the company of people. Oh, it's very nice to meet a lot of different people all over the world. May I mention Australia? We do get quite a few people from there.
Burton Road is Charles Dean. He's already part of Ravenglass folklore, a familiar figure to all who travel on these rails. Sir Arthur Haywood's concept back in the 1870s for small 15-inch gauge railways was largely based on ease of operation, where heavy loads could be carried on trains workable by one man. These days, much of Haywood's dream lives on at Ravenglass. The trains may be small, but there are serious people carrying concern, demanding an equally serious approach to controlling them. In fact, a key figure around here suggests British Rail may have picked up a thing or two from his system.
We utilise radio control, which is basically it was the forerunner of the use of radio for controlling the passenger trains in the British Isles.
Graham Withers is in charge of the signal box at Ravenglass. He's as much a part of this railway as the tracks and engines. He's also done everything from driving the trains to washing the carriages. An escapee from the bureaucracy of British Rail, Graham altered his lifestyle by arriving here and ironically ended up with the job he'd been after in the first place.
In those days, seniority on BR was what gave you the jobs into the new boxes, and that I just worked it out. It's about 31 years before I would get a job. I was offered a job up here, so I decided to come. In those days, things were entirely different to what they are now, but I was taken by it and I liked it. And in those days as well, I worked in the London area. And round the base, go ahead, 8 over.
The trains take priority when you're in Graham's office, so you shouldn't expect continuous conversation. In order to control what sometimes can total 40 trains in a day, the modern radio is used alongside an extensive array of old-fashioned mechanical levers. Graham's in command of the whole line from here, and with his system, he can tell you where any train is at any time.
What we do is we draw the pencil lines in of the proposed service for the day, and then the red line is the authority to occupy a section, and the green line is the actual path taken by that train. So for every section you come down red, green, red, green, red, green. If you've got 2 reds in one section, then you're into problems.
Railways are built on old traditions. One of them is the art of keeping trains apart as they rumble along the same piece of track. The ubiquitous red signal blade has become a symbol for trains everywhere, and to operate a traditional 26-lever signal frame is a real feather in Graham's cap.
The frame is fully interlocked as if it would be on a mainline railway layout. You know, we're just as responsible for the safety of passengers as the big boys are. 1210 train to Estelle, platform number 1. 1210 train, platform number 1. Trains return from Estelle this afternoon at 10 minutes and 30 minutes past each hour until 5:10 and then 6 o'clock.
Mr. Withers has been swinging the levers here for nearly 20 years. You need only a little time around the signal box to realise how vital this man is. The railway may be known to everyone as Ratty, but for this quiet English gentleman, it is a real railway.
probably the more complex, complicated, interesting story of any railway in this country anyway. It was a 3-foot gauge mineral line in 1875 when it set off, carrying iron ore, and then the improvements to make it fit for carrying passengers that our government wanted, that made the whole company bankrupt, and the mines closed shortly afterwards, and it ran with a receiver for about the next 40 years. and closed before the First World War.
Plotting the wandering course of events around here is a passion for Peter Van Zeller. 20 years as a full-time engine driver is long enough to have taken in a great deal about the long and convoluted past of this valley. The railway and its associated mining has always fascinated him.
There was an incline railway right down the hill, and they've literally cut out a slot 20 foot wide. Right, I mean, it's almost impossible to find any traces of it now, but they really tunnelled out to get the iron ore there.
As in the original Garratt's home on the west coast of Tasmania, a narrow gauge railway terminated at the foot of a steep rail haulage to transport minerals from a hillside mine. The advent of machinery in the 1800s prompted a more concerted effort to remove iron ore from its mountain home than the fitful attempts of digging by hand which had gone on since Roman times. But in this part of England, small mines were an erratic business. Numerous flirtations with a variety of owners and mining companies, even 27 years hauling nothing more than a few local supplies, meant the railway was in constant jeopardy. With the condition of the line ultimately unworkable, it closed in 1913. However, just 2 years later, as the destruction of World War I was gaining its horrific momentum, the Ravenglass Railway experienced a recovery in a new, smaller gauge.
And why it was turned into this size is really anybody's guess. The model maker, Mr. Bassett Lauk, found out about it during the war and converted it to 15-inch to run his little engines that normally ran on pleasure parks or around stately homes. And it's carried on since then.
While Peter may claim carrying passengers was the cause of bankruptcy for the original company, it's now the sole reason for the railway's existence. What Bassett Lauk made as a test bed for his model engines is now a successful carrier of people in their thousands. These days, tourist trains bypass a once steep pinch up into the old station at Boot, sweeping instead around an easier grade into Dalegarth. Nature is slowly painting over the signs of human intervention on her territory all those years ago. But you can still make out the original track bed and remains of some mine offices. Perched above the sleepy little hamlet of Boot, the bricks and mortar are slowly crumbling away. It's people like Peter Van Zeller who try to ensure the stories and memories don't follow the same fate. For many centuries, well before the dominance of steam and its associated machinery, the power of water on its own was used to literally supply our daily bread. The peaceful sound of water cascading down a large overshot wheel was heard in the background of hundreds of mills like this. Tucked away in the trees behind the village of Boot, only a few paces from the old mining station, sits Eskdale Mill. Built some 400 years ago, it's the oldest original mill in England. Restored to working condition, the stones still grind corn, but not for their traditional clientele.
I'm doing a bit of animal feed through it now. I suppose I'm the first one to actually mill with it. but I've sort of run the wheels and it all works, and it wants to grind a bit of grain, so I throw some in and away it goes.
It may be a cliche to suggest that time has stood still here, but there is no better description when you're amongst all this timber machinery. It's so easy to be transformed back to 1575, when the first flour was recorded to have been ground under these stones. Dave King seems to have crossed the time barrier himself, running the mill amongst the dust and cobwebs as though it was still 4 centuries ago.
The miller initially sets the gap between the stones just sufficiently to nip or burst the grain. It's called the shelling process. It's then picked up by the cups on the elevator, carried back up to this floor level and tipped into the shaker box, and the shaker box separates the bran from the meal. The bran being animal feed, the outer skin of the grain, and the meal being the starchy bit in the middle that the miller's after. And the bag of meal or semi-ground, which needs to be re-ground, is then hauled back up to this floor level by the sack hoist, and from there the sack is emptied once more into the hopper and back through the stones a second time on a closer setting.
With flour first ground on this site as far back as 1455 and a building dating back to 1700, first station on the Ravenglass and R.H.D.R railway is indeed an historic stop. Muncaster Mill is another working example of this bygone industry. It differs from the one at Eskdale in that it's been restored to meet regulations which allow for the grinding of flour to sell.
And if you want it any finer, have you got a sort of Magimix machine?
Yeah.
That, you know, you can break it down and make it much finer.
Yeah.
Sometimes check.
Did you make
Lovely. Thank you very much.
That's the whole meal. That's the whole flour with nout taken out. Okay? Now, clever mums can make all sorts with that.
There was an overlap period when steam-hauled goods trains carried the produce of water-powered mills before steam itself put an end to the water wheel. Goods trains are what a locomotive like the Australian Garratt would normally have been in charge of in its heyday.
Oh, sure. Aye, superb. Couldn't do anything else. Oh, I don't know, it's just a friendly atmosphere, I think. You get a good crack all round, everybody works together, we have a really good time.
The infectious enthusiasm of Trevor Stockton is part of the appeal for a visit to Ravenglass. 20 years of driving here has only heightened his love for the Ratty. It's a life many would envy. After all this time, he is still fascinated by the interest in steam power.
Well, there's a generation, or at least a couple of generations, come up since steam finished on British railways, but yeah, there's a genuine fascination with them. Everybody that comes wants to see them. There's been a tremendous amount of interest in the Garratt from a good few weeks before it actually got here. It's a fantastic engine. Yeah, it's really superb. Well made, and it's running really well.
Throughout its time in the valley, the foreign engine performed faultlessly. As a goods-type locomotive, it was only ever designed for slow speed. Yet it fitted into the normal passenger timetable so well, it simply became regarded as one of the local engines. The interest in the Aussie machine on tour in the Cumbrian Lakes district attracted enough people to give the railway its best crowd on bank holiday weekend.
Nice engine, super weather.
Yeah, good, no, really enjoyed it. It's well worth a visit, especially on a busy day like today.
Just wonderful. So you see, Britain's not so bad, is it really?
Soon enough, it's time for the little green engine to finish its duty here and prepare to head south. Behind it, the Ratty will settle back to normality, continuing to trundle through the picturesque valley, stretching away from this tranquil seaside village of Ravenglass. A preoccupation with times past seems to permeate through life in England. Nowhere is this more obvious than at one of the dozens of rebuilt railways trundling along old tracks in all corners of the country. The Keighley and Worth Valley Railway in the mid-north county of Yorkshire reaches the peak of authenticity in recreating the magical enchantment of the steam era. To ride behind a steam train was once as much a part of daily life as riding on a bus is today. To want to be an engine driver was the most common dream for a boy back then. An intangible fascination for steam, along with preservation of machinery involved with it, has a very strong following throughout the world. The Romney, Hythe and Dymchurch Railway in Kent encapsulates that feeling. The 13.5-mile run along the Shingle Coast near Dover is operated as a fast passenger service, making it the smallest public railway in the world. With Romney's flat country and an atmosphere reminiscent of a large mainline railway terminus, it's difficult to make a direct comparison with Ravenglass.
They're two totally different railways. I mean, Ravenglass, the scenery there and the whole ethos, I think, of the railway is very much on the narrow gauge, whereas Romney has been described as a main line in miniature. Obviously, there's a lot of common ground, the gauge of the railway, and the Haywood connection, because obviously Sir Arthur Haywood being the father of the minimum gauge.
Robert Featherstone's day job may seem unusual for a train driver, but the passion for steam encompasses many backgrounds.
I think I'm the only parish priest who's passed to drive here. So I think in a way I'm probably the railway's novelty act. When I was a little boy, my mother and father used to bring me on holiday to Dymchurch, and we used to stay in a caravan. I never used to want to go on the beach, but just stand by the level crossing and watch the trains. And I can remember saying to my father, I'll be an engine driver on there one day. And he used to say, don't be silly. Well, anyway, last year he had to eat his words because he came for a footplate ride. So I think, you know, it's in the blood, really. It's a great way of escaping from my parish work, and I thoroughly enjoy it. Very much so. Aren't we lucky having our own railway swimming pool like that? Absolutely. Really, I mean, you can't beat it. I mean, look at it, your own marvellous.
The entourage from Downunder knew the long, fast running on these rails would be a challenge. But to operate here at all, there was first a critical test to pass. To get more than half a mile from New Romney meant squeezing under this bridge, but it would seem they missed out by a short half whistle.
Tremendous. That's good news.
Solution? Remove the offending item and try again.
There we go, got a nice full cup.
Privileged use of Romney's royal carriages has been extended to a man who would be offended at the suggestion he is considered as royalty around this railway.
It's very exciting to see a Garratt on our railway. I've never seen anything like it before.
With a family deeply entrenched in railway engineering, Sir William McAlpine has made his mark rescuing trains in distress, the Romney being high on that list.
It came up for sale because the people who owned it couldn't make any money out of it and decided that they would close it down. They were sort of largely accountants, and I was approached by a friend and we got together a consortium to buy the railway.
Probably Sir William's most famous rescue was of a locomotive that subsequently made the last on-deck journey of a steam engine to Australia, but purely as a visitor. The Flying Scotsman's worldwide fame made its tour all over mainland Australia, a most memorable event for lovers of both trains and nostalgia.
Flying Scotsman's a bit different to this gauge, but actually these are miniature Flying Scotsmen. And the designer of Flying Scotsman actually came down and looked at these and rode on them when they were new.
As a return gesture by the Australians, this ride may have seemed a little less grand than the Scotties' exploits. However, the quiet, modest man, a true English gentleman, made it clear he enjoys all forms of rail transport.
So when I last saw it, it was a box of bits and a set of drawings. And I didn't really ever believe it would come to be what it is today.
During the day, after the previous night's jazz has died away, Howie Hotel is much like any other in Romney Township. But to members of the Romney, Hythe and Dymchurch Railway, it's a symbol of their founding father. The story of Captain Jack Howie enhances the strong link between England and the Antipodean Australia, the captain having inherited his vast sums of money through real estate in Melbourne.
Captain Howie was very fortunate in being a very rich man. His great-uncle had been in Australia in the 1830s and had attended the auction when Melbourne was first laid out, and bought some plots of land right in the middle of the town. It was in the Howie family for 130, 140 years, and I think at the end of that time it was the most valuable privately owned piece of land in the whole of the British Commonwealth.
You're just as likely to see John Snill out on a train as you are to find him behind a pile of paperwork in a fusty old office. John took hold of the reins as managing director after Bill McAlpine's rescue of the railway in 1972. His passion for speed, his wealth, his powerful manner, they all combined in a character perfectly fitting the image of the wild 1920s. Captain Howie's speed craze began with cars, and it was competing at Brooklands where he met fellow race driver Count Louis Zabrowski. Their other common interest in miniature steam locomotives assured a friendship, and they soon set about developing their ambition to create a main line in miniature. The problem was where?
Their first idea was to buy the Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway in the Lake District, but it wasn't for sale. Somebody else owned it and he was quite happy to sit tight. So they had to find somewhere else, and being competitive-minded, they decided that the first requirement was that they would have to have a railway which was longer than the Eskdale and where they could run faster than the Eskdale.
Howie lost his good friend in a fatal crash at Monza in 1924, during the Count's intended last race before sinking his efforts into their steam project. At that time, 2 engines ordered by both men were only half finished. Completing both was a fitting memorial, and Howie also continued hunting for a site to run them. The flat, featureless coast of the Romney Marsh was to prove ideal, and trains were running there by 1927. In his detailed book, One Man's Railway, John Snill intimates by its title that Romney Marsh acquired its miniature main line due to the indulgence and effort of one Captain Howie. While there will be inevitable differences in opinion over the relative merits of money versus physical effort, George Barlow feels more weight should be given to the role of Howie's engineer, Henry Greenley.
It's very sad, really. I mean, Greenley did everything. He not only designed the locomotives, he did all the paperwork and saw all the local authorities, and he designed the bridges, he designed the rolling stock, the buildings, everything. Howie, of course, did nothing, really. And then Greenley felt almost that it was his railway, and the old man, having paid for it, felt it was his. So there was friction.
George often quotes as a mark of respect to the great designer a long and reliable service history given by his engines.
They've done very well, though, when you think that Green Goddess was built in 1925, which makes her 68 years old. I think the engines are a living memorial to Henry Greenley, the man who designed them. He built them strong.
To measure the degree of respect held for George Barlow's own 35-year role as driver and operating manager, one need only note the patronage which has been in his charge at various times.
I had Walt Disney on the footplate. The most important one was when I worked the Royal Train, and I had Prince Philip and Princess Anne and Prince Charles all on the engine in turn. Of course, every locomotive driver wants to be a Royal Train driver, I think, and I did it on the 15-inch gauge, so that was quite a day. I was quite relieved when it was all over and nothing had gone wrong, I'll tell you.
George is the ultimate rail enthusiast. You simply can't sit down in his house without first pushing aside some item of train paraphernalia. All of the house is crammed full of railway books and models collected over a whole lifetime. Some things have changed on this line since George began here in 1946, such as a practical concession to using modern motive power for the daily school bus on rails. While most interested parties from George's era would shun the advent of the newfangled diesels, this man has a distinctly philosophical viewpoint.
I think we're using diesels to keep steam engines running. And we proved beyond any shadow of doubt that the diesel had turned a loss into profit. So as I've just said, we like to think we're running diesels to keep steam engines running.
But steam is still the real interest, and what more proof than to step into George's own backyard. His live steam railway club occupies the field behind his fence, which is owned by one of several members who also live in this row of houses.
Well, I'm told that I used to jump up and down in my pram when I saw a train, and I don't think I've changed very much, really. It's just got a bit worse with the years.
When the narrow gauge railway was built in the 1920s, this district was a popular holiday destination. But the pace has slowed in recent times in the wake of cheap airfares to the Mediterranean. That slower pace seems to suit craftsmen like Colin Bunn, applying his trade skills to the building and repair of rolling stock. The job entails turning your hand to a multitude of tasks.
Yeah, you have to do the lot, you know, and, you know, running repairs and all that kind of thing. And that's a new one we're building there. It's going to be a disabled wagon, you know. I mean, it don't work. It's a truck specially for disabled people because they can get wheelchairs on it.
This workshop has a blend of old ways and new materials. There's always something to learn, and trial and error was the order of the day with the wheelchair carriage.
We put the doors in the wrong place, and we got the doors up that end and the other one over there, and we had to turn them all round because when they went up a wheelchair they wanted to face the way the train was going. We never thought of that.
Behind the scenes work like that of Colin and Richard keep a railway alive, plodding along day after day with skills that are fast fading into obscurity. The countryside of Kent is as varied as its history. The rolling farmland away from the coast contains a splendid mix of scenery and early architecture. Towns like Rye and Lydd abound with charm in classic English style. Down on the marsh flats along the coast is a more barren outlook, with the shingle beach at Dungeness having been referred to as the land that God never finished. Such a desolate coastline was once a great attraction for the thriving business of an active smuggling fraternity. Under skies of battle even bleaker than this coast, the Romney, Hythe and Dymchurch Railway conducted a Second World War role akin to an episode of Dad's Army. The armoured trains patrolled up and down the line, doing their bit to protect the desolate seafront from unwelcome visitors. It's said the pilot of the only known enemy aircraft falling victim to their guns was mortified to have been shot down by a toy train. But the firepower of the tiny train must have been taken seriously, as numerous bomb craters beside the tracks testify to hostile attempts at its elimination. The train managed to survive the war, perhaps not with all its former glory, but still defiantly running. Romney Marsh may have lost some of its sparkle for tourists, but the train itself now attracts day trippers from London to fill the carriages. For the past 2 weeks, a foreigner has been an added incentive to take the M20 for a day's outing. The last weekend for the visiting engine in England showed that steam is still the real interest here. Friends of that most famous blue tank engine of all were chuffing around the place to prove it.
Hi, Josh.
And thank you very much for what you've done for us.
Enthusiasts may have been enthralled with the colonial engineering. Parents may have been intrigued at such a visit, but when the kids love your engine, you know the trip's been a success.